3 decades, we've seen a growing percentage of Americans who say that the criminal justice system is too tough. It grew from 2% in 1992 to 21% in 2020. You know, Dr. Ray, what are your thoughts when we're thinking about that trend? What are your thoughts on the shifts in thinking?
So that's a great question. I think there are two main patterns that we can point to. First, and this is something that Will Smith actually said is quite poignant. He said, racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. And as a result, people are becoming more aware of the punitive and brutalizing nature of our criminal justice system, which I should say rarely leads to reform. So as people are seeing these activities, oftentimes on social media, but also on mainstream news, being filmed by other people who seem like they are just everyday individuals walking down the street, that is having a big impact. I think the second big thing that isn't talked enough about is there's been a growing segment of white people across the country, particularly in rural America, who have been impacted by the opioid crisis. Consequently, they are now realizing how punitive drug laws for nonviolent offenders can have on actually destroying communities, and the impact that these laws can actually have on impacting families. So I think collectively, people are interacting with the criminal justice system in a different way. And one thing we know is that oftentimes when we talk about reform in the criminal justice system, that's not always happening. We also know with mass incarceration, there is a large percentage of Americans that know someone who has been incarcerated, oftentimes family members, people who, again, are engaging in nonviolent activities that people don't think should be criminalized in this way. We also know that people's various connections with the criminal justice system, from something as simple as a ticket, which might not even come from law enforcement, might actually come from a camera, and then they're late paying it, and they're looking at how that doubles and triples, and it could end up having a warrant issued for their arrest, like, say, in the case of Corinne Gaines in Baltimore. So collectively, people are experiencing the criminal justice system in a significantly different way. And I think that's impacting these broader trends that you're highlighting.
So, Dr. Ray, that's a good segue. You mentioned something about the opioid crisis and how it's impacting rural communities today. I want to talk a little bit more for some of us who might want to understand more of the impacts on Americans' sentiments on crime in the 90s. And how these have led to destructive policies that even today are having severe impacts on Black communities.
Yeah, well, when we talk about the 1990s, the 1994 crime bill and the politics surrounding it is probably the best example here. Crime was quite high in the late 80s, early 90s, primarily due to the crack epidemic and also people's access to guns. People wanted tough on crime policies, notably not just Republicans, but also Democrats like Joe Biden and even Black mayors in cities wanted to see guns get off the streets. They wanted to see more punitive measures. And as a result, with the 1994 crime bill, not only did some things that were extremely positive happen that we should note. First, guns did start getting off the streets. People could not have access to semi-automatic weapons in the way they can today, which is also contributing to mass shootings that have been increasing. For a period of time, about 10 to 20 years, people couldn't get that access to those particular weapons. And we can actually chronicle Columbine and some other mass shootings with some of those statutes running out. We also know that the Violence Against Women's Act was wrapped up in the 1994 crime bill. But one of the things that one of my Brookings colleagues, Bill Galston, and I highlighted in one of our articles on the 1994 crime bill, it also led to more policing. In particular, what it did is it expanded through the COPS program over 100,000 new police officers in the streets. They had to be given things to do. What that meant is that helped to start the process of expanding what police officers do, what law enforcement officers do. One thing we know today is that police officers are not only responding to 911 calls or responding to some sort of violent incident or doing traffic violations. They're also doing things like looking for potholes. They're also checking for lights. They have expanded their reach. And as a result, as we'll talk about a little bit later, some of the consequences of that is that they are actually overextended and overstretched in what they do. So the expansion of police officers actually led to having to find them something to do. And one of the big consequences is stop and frisk policies. People know about stop and frisk. A police officer sees someone, they think they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, they stop them. When we look at research, say, coming out of New York City over the past couple of decades, what we know about stop and frisk, there was a large study that looked at nearly 700,000 police stops. And of those stops, only 2% of those stops led to the discovery of contraband, a weapon, or an outstanding warrant. But in about half of the time force was used, and force was disproportionately used on Black people and Latinos in New York City, a Washington, D.C. study recently found something similar. Now, that starts the process of the criminal justice system that then leads to the other part that what happened with the 1994 crime bill, and that is the expansion of prisons. Local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, that helped to contribute to the huge mass incarceration that we know to exist. A couple of stats here. One big one is that at one point in time, about 75% of people who were incarcerated were in prison for nonviolent crimes, particularly nonviolent drug crimes, which disproportionately impacted young Black men. The other thing we know with the expansion of mass incarceration is that that also led to increased funding for what was happening with policing. And since the 1980s and 1990s, we have seen an over 300% increase in federal spending on law enforcement. And as much as we're talking about the 1994 crime bill, the 1986 drug bill, which helped to contribute to the huge disparities between crack and powder cocaine, also then morphed into the 1994 crime bill that led to this mass incarceration that we see today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so we do have a question in the chat here. And so Cynthia wants to know what our views are on Black crime, drugs, and gangster culture.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I get quite a bit. So I typically have two responses to it. The first response is even think about the narrative that we use, Black on Black crime. It's interesting that we say that because crime is just crime. And it's interesting that we don't say white on white crime. Why would I say that? Because as a statistician, one thing I know is that crime is intraracial. So yes, 94% of murders when Black people are murdered are committed against other Black people. But guess what? Nearly 90% of all white people murdered are murdered by other white people. But we never say white on white crime. Part of what we have to do is expand this to extrapolate to think about why we're saying Black on Black crime. Why are we isolating it? Well, part of what happens in a lot of areas, it's easy to isolate 12%, 13% of the population. And even in cities where we know things are concentrated, whether that be Baltimore, DC, Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, St. Louis, Detroit, we know there is a historical legacy of how these cities got to be where they are. Nashville is probably one of the best examples here, where Interstate I-40, if anyone has driven from east to west throughout the South or west to east, you know you pretty much drive on I-40. As a person who's from Tennessee, that was the interstate that I would drive going from my hometown in Murfreesboro to Memphis for college. And one thing that people don't know is that I-40 ran through historically Black neighborhoods, like the ones by Tennessee State, Fisk University, and Meharry University, which is a predominantly Black medical school. It completely demolished businesses. It demolished homes. It demolished opportunity. So as much as we talk about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, there's also this highway evidence that directly contributed to crime in Black communities that we can't shy away from. So it's not simply about cultural responses to crime. It's a structural response to crime. And so I think those are the two ways that we have to really think about Black on Black crime. No doubt, crime is a problem in certain communities, particularly low-income communities. But the solution to those problems has not been the solutions that we've thrown at those problems, which has primarily been to lock people up and try to transform people's culture. What people need are work opportunities. People need equitable education. And until those things happen and we restore those communities in a restorative justice framework, I don't think we'll really see crime decrease, because the same communities that actually need public safety and need resources are simultaneously the same communities that are being over-policed.
So you talk about, go ahead, Camille.
No, I was just going to piggyback off that question, that the statement you made about crime, how do we focus on being restorative in our response to crime? Whitney, I see you're nodding. Others can't see. But Dr. And you also talk about this facet of the narrative and the fact that, the talking about crimes in Black communities and terming it Black on Black crime. And this question is really going to how we depict, talk about, categorize the way we handle crime in our society. I think those who know you or follow you, you've spoken quite a bit about your children and you all's love for superheroes like Black Panther. But some of the things is the way that crime is depicted in the solutions, and some superhero stories containing messages really just that's centered around a punitive response to crime rather than a restorative one. How do we address this issue moving forward? And then what concerns do you have around the messages that our youth receive related to how we should be looking and responding to crime as a society?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And of course, when things get personal, I turn on my father hat, my parental hat, and my responses oftentimes are slightly different. And of course, people see Black Panthers right over my shoulder. I mean, once Chadwick Boseman passed away, my youngest son, Jeremiah, he has all these toys, all these superheroes, and we put him in my office, and he's pretty much stayed here during that time. He came to get him one time, but he's left him the other times. Look, as a parent, I worry about everything that my boys are exposed to, from Fortnite to Roblox to their peers. I mean, I'm worried about all of those things. But similar to adults, I think everything is about having conversations to prepare my boys for the various experiences and then responding to those experiences that they've had. We can't protect our kids from everything. I wish we could. And honestly, we can't protect them from anything once they are grown, but we can prepare them and give them context. In superhero stories, there's often fighting and violence, but also stories of resiliency and choices. And so we're very careful about what we present to them. But I also know, look, they're on YouTube looking at all kinds of stuff. I look at their digest, I look at their history, and instead of trying to police what they're watching, and don't get me wrong, there's certain things I'm like, don't ever watch that, right? But then there are other things that they're watching where I say, okay, let's sit down at the table, let's sit down on the couch, let's have a conversation. I think one of the biggest limits put on our kids' imagination for a better future are the adults who help to create and sustain an unjust society. I think part of my job is also to get out of the way and to allow their full dreams to blossom about what equity looks like without me imprinting their visions and potentially limiting that. I mean, they hear me all the time. They don't really care. They're like, okay, this is what daddy does for a living. But I tell my boys that one of their main objectives right now is to have fun, work hard for what you want. Don't just chase your dreams, go catch them, and do what makes you happy. These are some of the key aspects of, I think, what it means to be truly free in society. I want my boys to experience freedom just like other people's kids. And we know that racism is one of those tenets that can prevent that from happening. That is what I call when blackness becomes weaponized. That I know instantly my boys, and particularly my oldest kid, is going from this stage where in some people's eyes, he's instantly going from cute to criminal. That stage is the problematic stage that I want to help them to be able to sort through. And then, of course, in my professional work to ensure that when my kid is 16 and he might be taller than me walking down the street, that people still see him as a boy and a child and a young person who to be criminalized or call the police on or shut their door on, but someone who can also still be handled with care.
You know, that's a really good point, because when we think about our communities and being at home, we want to be safe, right? And we want to feel safe. But we're finding in our research that Black Americans are less likely to feel safe when they're walking alone in their own communities, specifically Black women, right? We're definitely not feeling safe. And so what are your thoughts on what will it take in order to restore that sense of safety in our communities?
Well, look, I think it's similar to what I was saying about blackness becoming weaponized. That one thing we know about law enforcement is that Black people are about twice as likely to be killed by police than whites. But interestingly, when Black people are unarmed, it doesn't shrink, it increases. Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when we're not attacking, nor when we have a weapon. Who says that? Police officers themselves. What that tells me, and what it should tell everyone, is the role that racism plays. It's clearly not a weapon. They're clearly not attacking, but instead it is something unique about Blackness that leads to that particular response. So I think safety looks like the disarming of Blackness, where it is no longer criminalized. This allows for safety to be primary and central, and then criminality to be viewed through the lens of behavior rather than Black skin. So I've conducted, obviously, a lot of research on this topic, and one of my largest studies did a mixed method study across the country, looking in racially integrated, predominantly Black and predominantly whites neighborhoods. And then I surveyed about 500 middle-class Blacks and whites. Everyone had at least a college degree. And what I found was that it wasn't simply a race or a gender effect. It was an intersectional effect. In particular, Black men were less likely to be physically active in predominantly white neighborhoods. That's this weaponization of Blackness that I was talking about. Black women, on the other hand, were less likely to be physically active in predominantly Black neighborhoods, which has to do with perceptions of crime, but also has to do with gender and being exposed to, as Bell Hooks talked about, the gaze when they're trying to be out in public and engage in physical activity. So it's not as simple as thinking about racism or sexism. When we look at this from an intersectional perspective, they come together to really highlight, in particular, the experiences of Black women. And I think if we really want to transform this, there are, various things that can be done with lighting. I mean, you can ride through different types of neighborhoods and you see that lighting is different. You see that pathways where people will potentially walk are different. And I've done this research, again, from Oakland to DC, looking at the different ways that neighborhoods are set up based on the racial composition of the neighborhood. So when it comes to Black women, we definitely see these things happening. I think there are a few things, in addition to using criminal behavior instead of Blackness, is to reduce racial profiling. And then it's also to look at 911 responses. One thing we know about people who live in Black neighborhoods, they are simultaneously over-policed and underserved. People are confused by that. So they're oftentimes confused when they hear local residents, particularly someone's grandmother or a person who looks like someone's grandmother, say, I want more police in my community. What she's oftentimes saying is that when I call 911, I want police to respond just as quickly in my neighborhood as they do in that predominantly white neighborhood down the street. And what she's also saying is when my 16-year-old grandson walks down the street and I just tell him to go to the corner store to get me a bottle of iced tea, he shouldn't be stopped simply for walking down the street because he's Black. That is the complications of policing. And part of what we have to do is, again, shift the narrative, our terminology, from thinking about just policing to thinking about public safety. And part of thinking about public safety is transforming the relationship that law enforcement has with local communities from a quantitative response, which is what happened with the 1994 crime bill. That was a quantitative response. We threw a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of people at a qualitative problem. What people want is a qualitative response. One thing we know about 911 responses, in most cities, 95% of calls for service deal with nothing violent at all. It doesn't mean they can't turn violent, but 95% of the initial responses are nonviolent. People want responses where people are served. But in Black and Latino neighborhoods, police show up later. First responders show up later. In those minutes, when a person has had a heart attack or a stroke or some other sort of accident, those minutes can cost people their lives.
Absolutely get where this dichotomy, and we see that show up in our data as well, Dr. Ray, which is this struggle between feeling safe and being afraid when the police show up and what will happen in those interactions. We are seeing in our latest measurements this past summer that we've seen a slight uptick in an increase in Americans' confidence in the police. And part of that is, like you mentioned, that response and how police show up. It's really more about the quality of those interactions. So I have a twofer. I know as researchers, we're not supposed to ask two-part questions, but really thinking about the future and what it will take to drive confidence in policing going forward, and how do we as communities and as a society create some accountability around that? What does accountability in policing look like? So what can we do to drive confidence, and how do we hold our policing authorities responsible for holding true to those things and kind of having some form of accountability around policing in our society?
Well, Camille, I love two-part questions. I think they're important, and I would expect nothing less from Gallup with the data. Like, we already know what the attitudes say. Now it's like, how do we interpret it, and what are the implications of it? I think when it comes to trust and confidence, look, I think people want to trust police. People want to believe them. They are viewed as superheroes. To go back to our discussion earlier, there are also active agendas from the federal government to the local level to make them into these heroes. One thing we know, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act hasn't been passed, but making Police Week something that is more nationally recognized definitely has. And I think police officers have the most difficult job in America, and they oftentimes engage in heroic acts. I know this from my own family. I have multiple police officers in my family, many of whom are retired, but some who are still active. But with this said, people experience police differently. And confidence significantly varies, as you all's data show, significantly varies by race because of those different experiences. One of the other projects I did in the DMV was a body-worn camera study. We were working with some police departments in the area. This was several years ago when they were thinking about rolling out body-worn cameras. They wanted to know what the public thought about it. They wanted to know what police officers thought about it. So we asked them one simple question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how positive are your relationships with police? White people are more likely to have higher positive ratings than other groups, including Blacks, Latinos, and Asians. But the qualitative difference, again, was what was interesting. And this is where I love mixed methods research, because I love the numbers. Okay, scale of 1 to 10, white people might say 8 point something. Black people are saying 6 point something. Okay, that's a gap. Why does that gap exist? One interesting thing with Black people would say, well, particularly Black men, they would say, well, I think I've had the typical experience like other people. You know, I've had police pull a gun on me for no reason, pull me over simply because I had dark tinted windows. No, that's actually not normal. But you know what? To Black men, that is the normative experience. So that was their interesting response. So with that being said, accountability means when people do something wrong, they are held accountable for it, including law enforcement. Accountability also comes along with transparency and equity. How do we think about this? Well, one thing we know is that over the past decade or two, police kill over 1,000 people in the United States every year. Over 1,000 people. That is a person in the United States killed every 8 hours. And as much as we talk about the racial disparity, because it does exist, but because the percentage of Black people are smaller, in raw numbers, there are more white people killed by police each year than Black people. So everyone is being impacted by this. Now, why is that important? When we look at FBI data, Department of Justice data, what we see is that less than half of these police killings each year are ruled as justifiable, meaning the Department of Justice, FBI, some local agency, state agency, said that this was a killing that was supposed to happen based on what was happening in the situation. But guess what that means? About 50% of these killings were unjustified. Does it change anything? It doesn't change a whole lot. Over 90% of police officers are never charged or convicted of a police killing or even a use of force incident. But guess what? That doesn't mean that it doesn't fall on taxpayers. If we only look at the past 5 years at the largest 20 cities in the United States, taxpayers have paid out over $2 billion with a B in civil settlements for police conduct that police officers are completely absolved from. And so as I've written extensively, including most recently with Clark Neely, Brookings put out a joint report with AEI that I helped to co-edit. And one of the things Clark is from Cato, and that should tell people something. We have all these different think tanks coming up with similar thoughts, similar perspectives. That should tell us something about where we are with law enforcement. When you follow the data, you come to the same conclusion. And what we've concluded, and other surveys have as well, is that qualified immunity is a problem. Qualified immunity is the court doctrine that prevents law enforcement and other government officials from being sued financially. Now, that doesn't necessarily extend to criminal court, but it does extend to civil proceedings. And so that $27 million that George Floyd's family got, the money that Breonna Taylor's family got, even the $20 million in Prince George's County or the $32 million that Corinne Gaines' family got in Baltimore, that money comes from taxpayers. And instead, there's a different model we could pursue. It's an insurance model where, similar to other professions, if a person is a plumber, electrician, a lawyer, and they do a service for you, guess what? They have to have insurance. Law enforcement could carry insurance as a police department and as individuals. The city of Denver and the state of Colorado is way ahead on this. They are now making police officers pay a civil settlement up to $25,000. A lot of that money will probably come from insurance policies. Smaller police departments already have this set up. It's a risk pool because they don't have the money like Chicago or New York to pay out millions of dollars in these settlements, so they have insurance. That insurance is another form of accountability. The other thing we need are federal standards. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. They're doing some quite different things. Sure, there are like some general things that everybody does, but we don't have a federal certification. That is really something that needs to happen. And then finally, locally, we need oversight boards, which is what the state of Maryland did. And I contributed to the Maryland Police Accountability Act. One big thing that came out of that, in addition to dealing with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, which helps qualified immunity go on steroids, but they also mandated that each local area create a civilian oversight board. In order to do that, it needs to be like what we're seeing in Virginia, right across the DC line, where they are putting law enforcement and community members on committees together. The city of Nashville has been doing this for a number of years, and it's highly effective for creating accountability, equity, and transparency.
I really like this conversation, and I want to keep it going. So I know that officers who protect and serve our communities are one very important aspect of the criminal justice system. However, there are other aspects of it. And so my question to you is, what other priorities should we be focusing on when it comes to the criminal justice system and how it needs to be reformed?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because we know that policing is on the front end of the criminal justice continuum. On the back end of the continuum are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who get out of prison every single year. So with that being said, we have to focus on a couple of things. After people are arrested, there is a process called pretrial detention and cash bail that needs to be reformed. Unilaterally, people think that's the cost. There are different perspectives. There are some people who think that we just shouldn't have cash bail at all. There are others who think that maybe we should do it like other systems, where maybe like child support, where it's based on how much money people make. So if you make more money, well, then your fine might be more. If you make less money, it might be less. Instead, of course, we traditionally done it based on whether or not we think people are a flight risk. The problem has been, oftentimes people in local communities who have probably never left their local community are treated as if they're a flight risk, even though they haven't went anywhere. And that disproportionately falls on people of color and poor people. So I think we have to reform pretrial detention and cash bail. There are people sitting in jails right now who have been in there for months, sometimes years, who could not pay their bail. And I think that is something that obstructs things. One thing people don't know about paying a bail is that if you don't pay and time goes by, it's like a ticket. It just starts accruing additional payments. And if you already couldn't make the initial payment, what makes us think you're going to be able to pay double, triple, quadruple that? There are people going to prison simply because they cannot pay their fine. I think the other big thing is dealing with returning citizens. Returning citizens, of course, are people who have gotten out of prison, who are coming back. Not only do we have to think about voting, but what we also have to think about is the reform that happens within prison. So that Brookings AEI report that I mentioned earlier, there are other chapters in that where people are talking about work training. I think one of the best examples of this is Flick Shop, which is a business that primarily has an app where you can send a postcard to someone who's incarcerated, but they also have what's called the Flick Shop School of Business to train people who are incarcerated, who are getting out, on how to think about the workforce, on how to also think about becoming entrepreneurs, because we know there's a huge issue with returning citizens getting jobs once they get out of prison. That all of a sudden impacts recidivism. They're more likely to reoffend. They're more likely to go back to prison. So overall, we need to shift the way that we think about punitive measures for real reform. And what that looks like is giving people opportunities in prison to engage in education. One of the things we've been exploring because we have a virtual reality training program for law enforcement at the University of Maryland, where I direct the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. But we have a new program where we are taking VR into prisons, where people will be able to put on goggles in their cells or in the prison library. They are sitting in a classroom with other people. They are learning. They are practicing a job interview. They're practicing how to get an apartment. They're practicing how to get a vehicle loan, because we know if we give people jobs, give people transportation, and give people a place to lay their head, we can decrease recidivism.
Ray, the chat is blowing up. And as we look to the future, and I want to make sure I get a couple of questions from the chat into our conversation. So thank you all who are kind of dropping those questions. So Dr. Ray, John asked about if our understanding of racism being systemic is true, what are those systemic changes that we should be prioritized for research and action at this time in our culture?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, if we talk specific, I mean, there are many things I could think about even beyond the criminal justice system. But I think when we think about the criminal justice system, it does start with accountability and the way that officers are held accountable. We have to transform that structure. So part of what that means systemically, and this is what I want people to realize about how this plays out. And I've done a lot of this research, and I've also been on a variety of task forces. Let me give you one common example of one way I see how misconduct goes unchecked. So not only do we see race and gender disparities in who's held accountable with outside of the criminal justice system, even in police departments, we see huge disparities in the type of discipline that a person receives. Let me tell a quick example on how this plays out. Let's take two officers, say one's white, one's black. They do the same thing. Say they wreck their car, or they cuss at someone, or they use force. Well, what happens is it goes through internal affairs. Well, what happens when it goes through internal affairs, somebody investigates. Then oftentimes it goes to a lieutenant, a captain, and a major who all review the report. They give their potential sanction. Do we want to fine this person? Do we want to demote them? Do we want to put them on desk duty? The thing about fines is that, say a person gets $1,000 fine, they're not paying that $1,000 at one time. Oftentimes it's prorated out of their check throughout the year. Like, I think police officers actually need to get paid more money. We could talk about that. Some people might find that interesting. But one thing I do know is that $1,000 throughout the year is like a Starbucks drink every paycheck. And so we could think about the impact that might have. But we also know that, say that captain went to the academy with one of the people that is being accused. And so they choose to give them a little bit more lenient penalty. After we accumulate all of these incidents that happen, one thing we know is that black officers are less likely to be promoted. They are also more likely to be disciplined. So I think one of the big systemic things that happens is that we need more protections, what I call a GAP program, good apple protections for police officers that are trying to blow the whistle, because they are more likely to be targeted. Oftentimes we talk about these bad apples that spoil the bunch. Well, the way I think about it, the tree can oftentimes be rotten as well. And even if you have a good apple, that good apple can be spoiled or poisoned, meaning they can end up acting similar to others, or they can be spoiled in a sense where they are literally pushed out or pushed down. They are demoted or they are transferred far away. Long story short, at the state level, what needs to happen is there needs to be a state committee that actually investigates all local actions. Because when you have people policing themselves internally, it's going to inherently oftentimes lead to these problems that mimic broader forms of inequality. I think that's one big thing. Again, as I talked about with the accountability structure with insurance, I think transforming qualified immunity will be huge. I know that Senator Booker and Congresswoman Karen Bass and Senator Tim Scott are having these ongoing discussions that I think is starting to have implications, particularly for Democrats, because people expected this months ago. Even President Biden did. But if they leave qualified immunity out of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the impact that that act has will be quite diminished. Now, with that said, there are some things that will be important. Quickly, a couple of things. First, there will be a couple of federal databases. One thing that people don't know is that the federal government collects information on a host of things. We actually know how many people get the flu. We're starting to have a better sense of how many people are actually getting COVID. The CDC even collects data on how many people get killed by jellyfish. But guess what? We actually don't collect data on how many people are killed by the police. only about 40 to 60% of police departments report into that. That should be mandatory. So we need this federal database, not only so that we can examine where we see use of force, but guess what? Also where we can examine where we don't, like the transformations that happen in Newark, that happen in Trenton and other places in New Jersey, where they've completely reimagined and in a sense rebuilt their police departments. We also need a database of bad apple officers. One thing we know is that a person could engage in an act, say, shoot a 12-year-old in under 2 seconds at a park, like in Cleveland, and months later, that officer can go get another job. That's what happened when Tamir Rice was killed in 2015 by a police officer in Cleveland. That officer went to get another job, then went to work at another police department. Why is he still working? Like, these are the kind of things that need to change. And these are systemic changes that overwhelmingly police chiefs support. They just don't have the policy to change it, which is why, as much as we focus on police officers, they're not the change agents. The policymakers that we elect to sit in state legislatures and to sit on Capitol Hill, they're the change agents that we need to hold accountable as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we have a comment or a question in the chat from someone wondering that, if do you think that the justice system would benefit from having more social work-based requirements and training, right? So as we think about those officers and their interactions with the community, would there be a benefit from them having that type of training?
Most definitely. Amazing comment and question. Yes. So a couple things people need to know about police training. Police actually get a lot of training, not as much as they should and not as much as other countries, but more than people think. But again, it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. And one thing we know is that police only get about 10 hours of de-escalation training, whereas they get a whole lot more of firearm training. So when they pull their gun, when they're in a high stress situation, we shouldn't be surprised. I'm honestly surprised it doesn't happen more based on some of the things I've seen with training. With that being said, we need de-escalation training. We also need officers to get mental health training, because we know that people who are experiencing a mental health issue, particularly an acute issue where law enforcement is called, and also where family members are calling someone, they oftentimes need a social worker to respond to that. The best example of this, let's go back to Denver. Denver created a program, it's called the STAR program. They pair up social workers with first responders. And to date, they've had 0 fatalities, 0 arrests, and they're getting people the help they need because they are responding to mental health calls. So when 911 dispatch comes in, they don't unilaterally send out police. Instead, they can sort these responses. That is extremely, extremely important. And that is something that is desperately needed, because in a lot of ways, the racial gap that we see in police use of force and police killing is also has an effect there that deals with mental health, particularly in the Black community and Latino communities that are not addressed in the way that they should be. Accordingly, mental health is not only important for the community, but also for law enforcement. There's a large data set that I have of probably about 7,000 to 8,000 police officers. And in this data set, the big punchline is that about 90% of police officers experience some type of mental health problem. And roughly that same percentage never seeks help for that mental health problem. These are the sort of things that we have to change. I think mandating mental health counseling for law enforcement quarterly, I think will go a long way, because we know hurt people, and these sort of things spill over into the streets, spill over to their families, and also spill over to themselves, because law enforcement has quite a high suicide rate.
Dr. Ray, as we close out, I would like to kind of, encourage our audience and listeners to just think about, what do you hope that the criminal justice system looks like 99 years from now? And my closing question to you, Dr. Ray, is if we continue to be intentional in trying to address the systemic issues that we have in our criminal legal justice system, in the year 2120, what does the criminal justice system in America look like?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it looks smaller. I don't really think people realize how big it is. I don't think people realize the extent to which Our financial system is wrapped up in it. You can literally go on the stock market and purchase stock in private prisons. That then leads to an incentive for people to be locked up. There are certain communities around the country where, similar to how factories used to be, where almost everyone in the city worked at that factory or had a family member that did. There are cities where almost everyone works at the prison or knows someone that does. We need to separate our finances from the punitive nature of the criminal justice system. So I think it looks smaller. I think second, I think it looks less punitive. Look, if people have never been to prisons or saw that, there's no surprise why people oftentimes come out worse than when they went in, particularly when people are going in for non-violent offenses. So I think that's one big thing. Third, I think our criminal justice system is more about safety and less about brutality. As we think about the 20-year mark of 9/11, I have an article coming out on this. I think about the broader implications of the way 9/11 helped to militarize our law enforcement. There are 2 federal programs where law enforcement, police departments are able to get military equipment. About 65% of police departments, of that 18,000 I mentioned, have participated in this. That has spillover effects to our streets when we see tanks at a protest, but also in incorporating a warrior versus a guardian mentality and disproportionately deploying SWAT, where as much as we were talking about Black women not feeling safe earlier, Black women are disproportionately more likely than all other groups to be killed by police when they are in their homes, like what happened with Breonna Taylor. So there are some real changes that need to happen. And part of that means we need more true rehabilitation, which I think that looks like setting up prisons system and the work system needs to be. By the time a lot of people get out of prison, after 10, 15 years, 20 years, the world has changed so much that whatever skill set they had, there's no way they can compete. We know that tech jobs are a big deal. And when we look more broadly, if we say just look at Black men are overrepresented in the top 10 fading occupations, meaning occupations that in 20, 30 years, people don't think are going to be around. And they are underrepresented in the top 10 occupations that are growing. We have to think consciously about that change. I do think the Biden administration is trying to do that. You know, he's banned federal grants to private prisons. I think private prisons are just shifting. Like now they're going into the immigration business more. They're going into the halfway house business more. But we have to separate what is happening with these prisons and our finances. And so I would like to think that in 2120, it looks like that when a person does something wrong, they're held accountable, whether that's a civilian or a police officer. They serve their time, but while they're serving their time, they get the skill set they need, whether that be mentally through psychological counseling or even the educational skill set to be prepared for when they get out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. The last 45 minutes have been amazing. I know Camille and I could ask you another 100 questions just from the chat. I know that our viewers could ask you a number of other questions, but where can the audience follow your work, right? I know you talked about an upcoming article. So if they want to hear more from you, where can they do that?
Yeah, I think it's a few main ways. The biggest place is just go to Brookings. All of my articles are there. You go to brookings.edu. You can search my name. I'll pop up, or you just put in your search engine, Rashawn Ray and Brookings. But people can also follow me on social media. I'm on social media at Sociologist Ray. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Just put in Sociologist Ray. I pretty much post all of my articles, my work, other related work, even primarily on justice, but even on other things. So yeah, people should definitely follow, send me a message, and I'll make sure that I try to follow back.
Well, that's our episode. Please continue to watch for new sessions in the next 99 Learning series. And again, thank you so much for joining us for today's discussion, Dr. Ray.
Thank you all so much for having me.